Great. So, Matt Christman of Chapo fame, welcome to Superstructure.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to just take a second to perhaps introduce our podcast, not just to you, but also potentially to some listeners who are listening for the first time. So we are a left MMT podcast. That's modern monetary
God
theory.
Damn it.
The trap has been set.
I fucking knew it. I'll tell you guys right now, I'm not going to talk about that. I don't care.
We don't, you know, what's great about this, Matt, is we actually don't talk about MMT either. We just assume it. So there's going to be actually an interesting way in which I think we could actually get at some real.
You don't want to fight about the taxpayer. You don't want to fight about the taxpayer dollar.
I don't care.
No, there's not going to be any balance sheet exercises or any of that stuff. We promise.
All right, just so we're clear on that.
No, we're clear. We don't. I know you don't care, and you know I think it'll be a helpful exercise because one of our interventions is to like try and synthesize more mainstream theoretical understandings of left political economy with the sort of more flat empiricist versions of MMT. So we'll get there, but
and the emotions are important. The emotions, it's not just about how that situates in the political moment, not in a nerdy way, just because that's part of what everything's part of, you know.
Yeah, and
that's the stoner comment to just start things out. So,
and so then I also wanted to say, like, we started our podcast after Bernie ended his campaign, and so like the first episode was called Critique After Bernie, and it's sort of situated in making sense of that context. And in a lot of ways, I think we, at least aesthetically speaking, have taken real influence from this sort of counter-hegemonic, you know, aesthetic, political, and cultural critique of Chapo. So I figured I'd say that. But as a way of getting into what the reason that brought you onto our show, which is one of our listeners essentially just tweeted at you saying you should go on this podcast to talk about your sort of articulation of the neoliberal moment, zero-sum thinking. I wanted to also say that where we, I think, depart from Chapo is in rejecting zero-sum thinking, not just as a political like possibility, but at the level of social, cultural, and monetary politics. So we'll get there. But I wanted to start by just playing a clip from your stream, episode 115 of the Grill stream, to contextualize what your thinking is on the neoliberal moment, and then allow you to talk about it. So let me just pull this up and we can play it.
And that is why politics in this era now, as I have said before, is about distributing the pain, the inevitable pain of the neoliberal order to your enemies, because it's their fault this is happening. We are in a sinking ship, and it's two groups of people trying to kill each other because they think that they're the reason that they slammed the iceberg. That's it. And I mean, look at the extreme left and like meme people online. What are like the archetypal edgelord memes of the left and right? Guillotines and helicopter rides. There's no, in neither of these imaginariums are you talking about justice, or are you talking about a new worthwhile social order? Nobody has any hope in that happening. Even the Nazis don't imagine they're going to get some Edenic splendor. And on the left, nobody's really thinking about anything beyond revenge.
So, Matt, can you tell us more about that?
I think that it brought amongst people who are going to be voting, right? Like not at politics at the level of theoretical or the level of even internal critique within either party, as the mass of people voting in elections. I think more over time, as we get greater and greater deterioration of conditions in this country, the upshot of their vote will be a vote not to gain anything for themselves, because that's off the table. It will be to punish someone for the mere condition of their life. and the two parties, the choice between the two parties will be a choice between two rogues galleries of enemies of villains who we imagine the state can be brought to bear against. That's the basic gist of what it seems like to me we're going to see in politics and already are seeing.
So I think, perhaps to bracket some of the, like, whether that's true in the sense of, like, where our contemporary political horizon is going, because I definitely think we would probably agree with certain aspects of what in this sort of reified neoliberal imaginary we can look forward upon it, barring that there isn't a sort of change in the way that sort of our collective consciousness is sort of thinking politically. I think one of the things that we try and do in this podcast is take a step back a little bit and reconsider what this question of neoliberalism implies. And one of the main cruxes of it that we identify is the sort of Thatcher notion of there is no public money, there is only taxpayer money. And this sort of atomization and individualization of political and collective monetary sort of consciousness is a sort of profound moment in the way we see this sort of zero-sum thinking taking place. And so I think that that's something we would want to unravel as a sort of sense of political possibility, but then also perhaps to not take this sort of, and I realize you're also hedging on the voting question, like who's voting, but to not take this quite at its word in that sense.
I think it's interesting the focus on voting and masses, because I think, and sort of this zero-sum sense of, what stuck out to me with your thing was the guillotines and the helicopters. But it's interesting to me to think of, like, okay, like, if we talk about the successes there have been, like, I don't know, Cory Bush, am I getting the name right? Shit. AOC, Ilhan, Rashida, like, what, not to say that's, like, our full horizon, like, not to say, like, only the squad ever and that growing is everything we need in politics. Like, obviously, we have, like, deeper vision than that. But, like, what were the enemies in those circumstances? And, like, what were the... what did make the masses of people angry, and what revenge were they taking if that's what was happening?
You mean in, like, elections for, like, Cory Bush?
Sure.
And AOC?
Sure. Because if you're posing that it seems like all voting is like something to gain for yourself to punish someone, because the primary emotion of voting is going to be like where the mass goes in terms of their anger, right? And who they want. So if that's what you're posing. And so, like, what anger would the successes we've had at all come out of?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's not totalizing, it's a trend. And the trend is more noticeable at the larger population levels. So it's going to be least noticeable at like an individual congressional race. You know, when you're talking about AOC, I mean, she won her primary with, 20,000 votes?
Sure.
I don't know how many Cory Bush got, but I'm not imagining it was a ton. And I mean, and how many of those are voting just in a context of voting for Democrats? You know, I mean, the specific messaging in a specific campaign, I don't know enough about because I wasn't there. And my main issue with that is like a rejoinder is that I don't see it scaling. Even if there is something there, I don't see any mechanism whereby it scales, because the party that these people are in is completely at its top level. And not, and when I say top level, I don't just mean elected officials and obviously all of the donors who
you mean the DNC.
The DNC, and more importantly at this point, its media apparatus are hostile to it, are hostile to the project. So and we've seen where those entreaties have gone when they've gone up against the greater might of the Democratic Party. Like, they're able they can express, like a localized dream for some sort of social democratic reform agenda, but in a party context where there will never be any knock-on effect beyond the local, because everything above the local level is pressing in the other direction, and there's nothing to countervail that pressure.
It's interesting. Yeah. I think that there's always a lot of different things going on, right? Like, I feel like you're reading it a little bit univocally as well, right? Like, well, if anything happens ever, that's still like in contrast to the larger doom, right? But I live in Chile, and that was true in a lot of ways for a long time, right? You have in the early 90s that there's the democracy, but Pinochet's still around, and you have like 20 years of like center left, sort of 20, 30 years of the Concertación, the center left, right? And there's a lot of electoral skepticism, right? And there's a lot of, with the binomial system, there's a lot of debates about that always. But at the same time, like, you never know what theory of change is going to like pop up, but people are always trying shit, right? And like, yeah, like people hit the streets last year in October, and then they like got a deal through some deputies for like a process to vote on a new constitution. Like, you don't know, like, and that had like been previously with a whole year of, indigenous struggles in the streets, huge student movements, fighting cops, like unions, like it's just like an all hands on deck thing all the time. Cause like, what else would it be? Right. As opposed to like focusing on inevitable doom. Like, you want to know where you put your energy, right? And you don't want to like waste your time, obviously, but like, you're always trying shit and like trying to move people and find where you're going, right?
Yeah,
I agree. I mean, that's what I've been trying to do with my stream, is redirect to the extent that I can. If there, I've discovered, my role, and the role of honestly anybody in political media, is entertainment above all. That is the actual raison d'etre for it. Everything else is sort of honestly self-flattery more than anything, like a sense that you're not just entertaining people, but like there is also your moral, the moral sense you have yourself that you should be doing something good. And to me, like I was thrown into crisis, like a lot of people were, after the Bernie campaign ended, because what next? And doing the same thing seemed totally untenable. And just deciding to just cynically embrace my role as a political entertainer also seemed morally untenable, considering how monstrously terrible everything appears to be. And that's what kind of drove me towards challenging a lot of my preconceptions. And the big thing I came away with is that that the mechanisms that we've taken for granted to come to those understandings of what to do, what action we should take, are designed to do the opposite. They're designed to obfuscate what's in front of us and make us focus instead on abstract concepts and personalities and our own hidden desire to be validated, and those end up taking over completely, and
do you think it's bad
making it impossible for us to recognize any opportunity that might emerge in front of us that we could profitably engage with.
Do you think it's bad for people to want to be... Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to say, like, I think that Chapo was actually very, like, it did play a role beyond entertainment, like in DSA and in kind of organizing a certain culture and a certain subjectivity and a certain framing around the Bernie campaign, and taking it back to media in general, because like we call ourselves Superstructure because we do take media very seriously.
That's disgusting, William.
We take seriously the ways in which media actively shapes the terms of our discussion, which shapes, like, it conditions horizons of possibility. And I think that, like, taking it back to how, like, the mainstream media forms have, like, influenced the debate, like, around, you know, in both of the Bernie campaigns, and obviously, you know, Biden and Trump, we have implicitly, and we try in this podcast to trace this back to this idea of money being finite and coming from taxpayers. We have this notion that politics is fundamentally just about distribution rather than creation, because in order to create, you have to take from somewhere, and you have to take from taxpayers. And I think that this comes out in,
which Bernie was very guilty of, right? I mean,
and I think that this comes
as
out
much
in,
as we,
in the grill stream that you do. What this implies is that for somebody like my interests take from your interests necessarily, unless there is a concrete, particular material common denominator, right? And this is the Marxist idea of, you know, class and organizing on the basis of class. But when we talk about public goods, right, like we can talk about like, you know, healthcare, right? Like we can talk about healthcare abstractly as this kind of universal good and think of that as this common denominator that everybody can unite around. But there's not actually there's not a surgery that everybody needs right now. You know, like once you actually drill down, you're talking about provisioning really particular things, and that necessitates zero-sum conversations about trade-offs, and it necessitates conversations that on our reading lead towards this, you know, kind of dialectic that moves, frankly, towards fascism in the long run, regardless of our intentions, because, you know, you're never gonna out zero sum the right wing, right? And you can, like, articulating something like, you know, gender reassignment surgeries for trans people, for instance, if you articulate that through this zero-sum taxpayer money framework, right? After a moment like Bernie's second loss, people are going to be thinking, oh, well, maybe that shouldn't be central to the program, right? And you end up you switch to this register of normal people versus fringe issues and versus outsider kind of issues, and that I think is the core of our critique, and we take media very, very seriously, both in its role in constructing this zero sum framework, but also as a possibility, you know, to like following the non-zero sum framework, right? Like of money, right? Like superstructure, money, law, media, like all of these things, fundamentally, they do not, like they're first movers in terms of organizing real, like, political action. Sorry, what were you going to say, Natty? And then
sorry, but and also I think that just in a little response to what Matt said along those lines, that I don't think it's either inherently bad or against politics for people to want to be validated or affirmed, or for people to want to be entertained and reach out and talk to people, because I think that's the basis of what all politics is looking to be an interrelated species, because that's what we are, and so that's never going to go away. And so I don't think it's inherently bad to want to, you know, sometimes just like be entertaining too while you talk about politics. You don't have to think you're like changing the entire world, but participating is what we do because we care. So you participate, and it's okay that you meet people and you talk, and relationality is possible because we can decide that, you know. Anyway.
I mean, okay. I guess I don't know what you. I mean, you're the upshot of this I'm getting is you're trying to pitch this idea. Well, it isn't zero sum, but it is practically. The two parties have agreed. There is no pressure that can be placed on them within the party structures as they exist, within politics as it is practiced, that can push them away from that bipartisan agreement, that's the way it is. Now, that's not to say that we can't do anything, and that there is no reason to, you know, that we should give up. People say that I'm black-pilled, and I'm just saying that the institutions and the structures of like media pressure and messaging that we are putting our energy into cannot generate what we want it to, and that anything that is going to actually break apart this consensus is this elite consensus is going to have to come from without, and that's why, like, I don't really talk about like the specifics of different, you know, visions of like funding mechanisms for a hypothetical reform agenda, I talked about how utterly poisonous the very investment in politics as such ends up being for your ability to recognize anything that could be actually effective in challenging the status quo.
Well, sorry, yeah.
And where is without? Where is that? Where is without?
I think it's at the workplace.
It has to come from
I think
without?
it's at the workplace. Honestly, I think it's going to be people in the remaining nodes of leverage and impact on the American economy, organizing for their self-interest, which they recognize to be invested in the self-interest of their fellow workers, and then out of that, a new political culture, and probably a new political party will emerge. At
So
least
is media
if there
separate?
if there is to be a meaningful challenge to this sort of death spiraling neoliberalism we're in.
And is media separate from the workplace?
I think that it is irrelevant to the workplace. I mean, yes, people are being shaped by their interactions with media, and they're taking them into their interactions with their fellow workers. But if they are invested in politics as they are practiced in the media, and if they are members of this like self-appointed political class within the greater American populace who have decided that I am a political agent, I am going to seek political power through the application of my reason and my intellect and my spirit through engaging with it. If you are bringing to that workplace the stuff from that media ether, it's going to be a hindrance to your ability to engage with your fellow employees, your fellow workers, rather than an aid, because they will not know what you're talking about.
I think far be it to universalize a sort of anecdote, but I thought this could be helpful. It's my experience of coming to like left politics was decidedly one of media consumption, which is to say, including the likes of Chapo and Twitter and these sorts of things. And so I think
that's gross. Stop it.
I think part of our contention is right that there's a too totalizing of a view that just says like that determines this sort of what I've heard you call spectacle in the past, Matt, as a structure of sort of totalized spectacle. Rather than thinking in the ways that the sort of matrix of forming consciousness can be created by all different means all at once. And I mean this also to say, like, coming from that sort of media conditioned leftism that I came to, I participated in a wildcat strike this year at the University of California, and there's, right, which is to say, of course, that there is also a link to my very exploitation inside a system that led me to that decision, and to an active organizing role in that decision. But there's also, importantly, this sort of intellectual bedrock for me specifically that led to my specific participation in that wildcat strike. And so I guess what our contention is that the media conditioning of subjectivity shouldn't be just given over to the right and to the so-called center, right? The left, and I think what, again, is so powerful about creating alternative media spaces on the left is that it can actually reach people, right? I mean, and we hear, I've heard from people who've listened to our podcast that we have changed the way they've thought about things and the way they've acted in their workplaces. And so I guess... And Matt, I'm sure you have too.
Only thinking, and then the thought dies, and it just rots.
I'm sure you have too. And so I guess we want to really push back against this sort of this sort of sense that we only need this sort of material class struggle on its own without a sort of constitutive counter hegemony to come with it.
Which is not to say there's not obstacles.
But it's not counter-hegemonic, I would argue. It is within the greater hegemony. It reinforces.
That's the nature of counter-hegemony, though.
Well, right, but I mean, in such a way that it when applied to life, it ends up just splintering. I mean, look at DSA as a good example of this. Look at how riven DSA has been since its big explosion in 2016. Look at how it has been incapable of generating any sort of coordinated agenda. And I would say that a large portion of the reason for that is because the people coming to DSA are coming to it from having been radicalized by their interaction with this counter-hegemonic left media, and are bringing to the project of a socialist organization the priorities, expectations, rhetorical conceptions, shibboleths, dividing lines, good versus evil conceptions that they got there. And because the thing is, you're talking about how it create online, the media, the left media sphere. However you're talking about it, the podcasts.
They listen to you.
Yeah, well, not just me, but whoever. It's not just about. See, the thing is, it's not just listening to somebody, because there's not one point of view. There's a bunch of different arguments about different components of this and what's to be emphasized, what issues and what positions are most important, what oppression is most salient.
When in history was that not the case?
What I'm saying is there is nothing within that space to resolve those. They only continue to be had, and then they are brought to a place like DSA or to the workplace, and then those synthetic arguments are reenacted in the real world.
So when in history has that not been the case?
Splinterings and the same incompatibility and the same incommensurate worldviews that were first generated in the media sphere.
So when in history has that not been the case?
Well, the thing that's different about this is that we are fully atomized to a degree that no previous humans, certainly in any place that has seen real, like, effective left-wing working class movements have been. We don't have a working class as such in this country. We have
what
workers.
Is a working class?
A working class is a class that operates at some level, has some ability to express a interest for itself as such, as a class. But class is not lived in this country. Race is lived, gender is lived, identity is lived, being a consumer is lived, but being a worker is not.
So Max is a Puerto Rican Floridian grad student in a wildcat strike, or AOC when she talks about the Green No Deal. That's never in terms of class.
Well, it's in terms of class of people who went to college.
Really?
People who have received the training. I mean, the fact that you said a wildcat strike, my eyebrow raised, and then you said at my college, I'm sorry, the other eyebrow went up too.
No, because students are not workers, right?
It doesn't matter if they're workers. They are operating as students.
Grad students and teachers unions, are they part of the working class movement?
There is no working class movement. That's what I'm saying, is that there are people operating of what they think are their own self-interest. Then they adhere them to other people in what they think are maybe some sort of class identification. But it's all pseudo class politics that has been recreated and recapitulated in the media sphere because we do not live class.
What's an historical example of a real class movement?
I would say I mean, the working class movements that generated the labor movement or labor parties in Europe at the turn of the 20th century, that's like the prototypical example of a class of a working class movement. Like that's the one that Marx was anticipating and then sort of came into being as he was describing the conditions that would create it. But that's what we're all sort of subconsciously or not imagining when we talk about working class politics ever since. But the conditions specifically in the United States, because you can talk about other places, that's fine. I'm not from there. I'm from here. Now, I don't feel like when people wanted me to talk about other countries, it's like I will and I will listen to people. But I honestly feel like it's not my place, because why would I want to presume a level of knowledge and an awareness that I don't have in order to appear authoritative? I do feel like
I'm not asking you on other countries.
No. I'm just establishing why I'm talking about the United States.
Right.
All right. Okay.
No, we know what we know, of course.
What I'm saying is that in the United States, due to the process essentially of the working class coming into itself as a political actor with the New Deal, as the working class expressing itself through a labor movement that had a place at the table within the mechanisms at the highest level, like the deliberative mechanisms at the highest level of the Democratic Party. That persisted until the 1970s and has been replaced with a situation. And what happened during that period, while the working class was at its zenith of influence within the political system, and the political system could accommodate working class demands because of the historical fillip of mega profits in the post-war era, that working class was essentially de-workified, turned into consumers, turned into petty landowners, the white ones anyway, with suburbanization, the black working class largely ghettoized, and that geographic dispersal was then compounded by the media dispersal, first with mass media through television, and then finally through the internet, such that our day-to-day lives do not contain the shared experience of work, of labor exploitation that generated class consciousness in previous social conditions. And so we are now all, first and foremost, as we live our lives, consumers who compose a demographic identity, and we approach politics that way. Now, and then we go through college, the ones of us who do, we learn notions, and we have refined notions of class and exploitation and socialism and all these things, and then we try to apply them to our lives. But the only place we really can is, for the most part, online and in our media consumption. And then in so doing, we create notions of our ability to affect change that are detached from our actual lived conditions, and more importantly, the lived experience of the vast number of working class people in this country, the most exploited, the most miserable, the most, by any Marxist theory, the most ready to be radicalized, who are most likely to have not gone to college, have most likely to have not encountered this articulation of these ideas, and therefore are the least, you are, having gone through that process, least able to communicate with, if you are communicating through that mechanism. Like if you're, this is why I'm saying it's not really a question of like.
Isn't that kind of a right-wing framing that like they're getting corrupted by the colleges?
Well, they're not being corrupt. It's not about corruption or anything like that. It's just about It's about acquiring a vocabulary and an internal mechanism of like values that is just not shared. And so it makes it so that the communication, it makes it so the communication is more difficult. And what has to be done is that you don't like whip yourself. You don't shoot people who are wearing glasses like it's Phnom Penh 1975. You just humble yourself. You don't necessarily stop engaging in online disputations or media consumption. So you don't think anyone try to position that in a way that only when you're if you say are working with other people and it's a condition where there is a common grievance and common exploitation, you start there. You start from that common experience. You don't start from the models that you've acquired through exposure to media.
So I guess where I want to like resituate, because you talked about American history here, and we're talking about common experience, right? And it doesn't have to be universally determined, totalizing common experience. But what we share in this neoliberal moment, a common experience of precarity. I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the defining characteristic of American politics.
Exactly.
And it's what drives the zero-sums, like dueling sadisms of the parties.
Absolutely. And I think we both agree on that sort of neoliberal stasis. Now, the question is, looking back to American history, right, you sort of noted that American history is has a more complicated relationship to these sort of demographic identifiers, whether you want to call it class or, we thinking about race and then region and these sorts of things. But importantly, like you talked about the New Deal, you sort of talked about the mid-century moment. I think our contention here is that the New Deal and the creation of the working class, right, in this country, which again we can complicate on areas of inclusion and exclusion, and through World War II, the real like industrial policy at the heart of World War II, and coming out of it, the sort of relegation of that industrial policy to a sort of privatized intervention in cultivation of these sort of corporate monoliths that facilitated our sort of more abundant fiscal policy than that of later years, precisely on our reading, not in some sort of reductive single causal way, but in a constitutive way, was the lever by which we ended up cultivating these subjectivities of class in this country. And also, crucially, the contention that underprivileged and oppressed minority groups could advocate for an abundant sort of agenda, right? We see this with the freedom budget and MLK, and which is not to say that MLK's movement was a sort of strictly class-based movement. I think that was its strength, personally, right? In that it incorporated all these different components into this sort of analogical matrix of resistance and tactics, right? It's not just about being in the streets, right? And fighting those immediate struggles, but it's also about changing people's minds. And it's also about getting politicians in office who are going to be necessarily imperfect in nodes of power that can help facilitate said struggle. So I think it's precisely the American history that demands an alternate view and centers the way not just media in the sense of like mainstream news media, but media in the sense of mediation can facilitate the coherence of these sort of disparate, more so atomized, more so decentralized nodes of resistance. Because I think that's ultimately our contention. And centrally through that, we need also a political practice that goes at this precarity, this austerity, and I don't just mean this in a cutting budget sense, at its core. And so that's why we believe in sort of a public education approach around public money, and that's why we call ourselves MMTers, which again, we don't have to get into the details of that, but that I think is our contention. And when we're thinking historically about building a movement, it's not just an either or proposition. It feels like you're internalizing that zero-sum neoliberal precarity onto a methodological structure of resistance.
I think what I'm doing is I'm recognizing that the Democratic Party as currently constructed is not going to be a vehicle for any alternative anything.
As it's currently constructed.
Yeah,
correct.
But that there is no mechanism that exists to change that through any public education campaign or because who are you educating? You are educating people who already have. Who are you educating? You are educating presumably people who are already alienated from the Democratic Party, right? People who already are unsatisfied with the Democratic Party's agenda and its drift. Well, we know what those numbers are, and they are insufficient. The Democratic base has been fully ideologically captured by the party through its media apparatus, and those people. I mean, you're talking if there's going to be a change, literally just be old people dying and being replaced by younger people. But those younger people are still going to be getting their cues from a party, or not even getting their cues, but just having to live within a structure. I mean, all right, here's the deal. We're gotten Biden for 4 years, right? Let's just see what's going to happen, honestly.
I love him.
I mean, I don't
He's
even
great.
I don't even know why. I don't really feel like I need to make an argument. Like we know
We're
what
not
the party is capable
pro-Biden.
of doing. We know why. No, you're not. I'm just saying is that the fact of Biden as the president coming up, the fact that Biden got that nomination, to me it indicates that the existing mechanisms for pushing the Democratic Party in any direction from below within the Democratic base, like as an electorate, can happen.
So I guess, I mean, it's funny. I don't think we disagree too much about the next 4 years, except perhaps in the sense of particular struggles. I mean, we could talk about student debt. I think maybe we should. But I think as a general matter, what we're talking about is not a sort of 4-year or necessarily even an 8-year strategy, which is not to say, like, at another level, we're not exactly hopeful in some like naive sense, right? It's just the path that we want to articulate is one that, you know, foregrounds the fact that as we are rejecting Biden as a left, we're pointing to the fact that Neera Tanden is going to be director of OMB, and Neera Tanden is a hard austerity, sound finance liberal, right?
Like our friend Doug Henwood, the sound finance socialist.
Well, right. I mean,
Sorry.
and so I guess
See, this is what I'm talking about. You guys want to have scores? You want to settle scores with Doug Henwood because it's a bullshit from Twitter. Come on.
How is
let's
it from
take on the
Twitter?
real point.
Twitter, come on.
Okay,
That's
fine.
Jacobin.
Articles too.
Yeah.
Articles of
Yeah,
Jacobin. I'm sorry.
But let's take on the real point here, which I think is that, like, we don't think we have to choose between Twitter and politics, but
I didn't see that's where we disagree.
well, right, but that's exactly the point, right? That's a zero-sum framing. We want to take things on at all levels, which is not to say that
No, we have to create new levels. We have to create new structures. We have to, and they have
Absolutely.
to emerge from practice, not from the media hothouse, not from the social media entrepreneurial war of all against all that we look at and squint at and think is a politics.
But you're also saying the
media
reason we
is
have to
practice,
lose is
too.
media. Yeah, and you're also saying that the like part of the, you know, it's a big obstacle, right? Like the mainstream media, but you're also like very centrally putting their media apparatus in your view of people's subjectivity, which includes workers at the workplace. Like why would you surrender just prematurely? Why?
Well,
What's the point of that?
I guess the question I'm asking is, who are the political subjects we're talking about? Who are
Everybody.
the people? No,
Yeah, so, I
it's
mean,
not everybody. It's not everybody. I disagree with you on that.
Maybe this would like speak.
I
more
disagree
to-
with you on that.
Okay.
I do not think everybody is a political subject in the same way in this country. For one thing,
Nobody's
I think
a
not
political
identical.
subject that's the same anywhere.
But what I mean is that I'm talking. You're talking about the specifics of like this, the idea of counter hegemony in media and like messaging. The audience for that is a type of political subjectivity that is not everybody.
Just like all political subjectivities are not everybody.
Right, but this specific one is bounded by the experience of absorbing a set of values through, I think, I would argue, largely a collegiate experience that is not universal in this country, and that by having gone through it leaves you, if you're sticking with it, not inherently, not tainted in some spiritual sense, but if you insist upon making your politics into like a mentally reified construction that you are then going to take out in the world and try to engage people with, unintelligible to people who haven't had it.
I've gone to
Okay,
riots with people I met on Twitter, and not everybody at the riot went to college.
Riots are an expression of the inability of people to formulate a coordinated action.
But they're also
it's another expression of our failure to have a coalesced like working class identity. Is what do? We do things individually. We listen to things individually, we post individually, and then even when we want to go out and do something, what we do is we go and we riot individually. And then maybe in the course of the riot, some forms come together of organization. But then as the lack of an actual actionable and achievable goal persists because of our lack of a deliberative process, the energy disperses again.
Like
which
Chile
is what we
getting
saw
a new,
all summer.
A new
We saw all
constitution.
summer were these eruptions of anger and frustration and oppression that were eventually channeled into either like recapitulated by the Democratic Party or disavowed by the Democratic Party and used as a excuse for why they didn't do so well, or symbolic ritualized actions like pulling down statues, because
But how?
we're coming at it individually.
But how undialectical is thinking that the BLM movement over the summer has not then cultivated a space for a sort of like when this all erupts again, sadly, when a cop kills a black person in on camera again, because it's going to happen, there's going to be a new eruption in the context of the consciousness that had been cultivated by the previous.
But consciousness, yes. But what if it's just consciousness? Then you're just going to see a repeat. It has to be durable institutions. It has to be something where people can alienate authority to, take orders from, in order to make any of their actions feel like there's any reason to do it. I mean, when the police come in and start cracking heads, and you know that further involvement in any kind of demonstration is going to just result in you going to jail or getting beaten up or something, and that's the only plausible outcome of it, because there's no forward movement, there's no momentum towards anything other than that, and there's no structures emerging to be durable, then people are going to stop showing up, which is what happens over time. And you get this repeated like lapping up, and yes, people, and yes, like the consciousness, the concepts are being, continually reinforced and validated in people's minds. But if that's not joined to something beyond the personalized indulgence in demonstration as like a personal validation, then it can't do anything other than just become a cycle of resistance, suppression, fallowness, and then once again another outburst.
So I don't think that difference and particularity can just be collapsed into atomization, and maybe this will speak to you, because I want to say something about how the economy is structured and how material production is structured, which is that the economy is an interdependent input-output structure that is circular, where people are doing different things, and their difference is figured in the context of coherence in larger structures that we all change or reproduce from various nodes. And so I think that I think, in my opinion, part of why we're talking past each other and what I think is the mistake that you're making here is seeing particularity and seeing subjectivity and seeing, people's lived experiences, setting aside whether there's a difference between people's lived experiences and their, objective, relation to capital. But I think that it's a mistake to see those lived experiences as necessarily atomizing or requiring subsumption into a common material denominator, because it's our material differences that cohere within a larger structure, right? Like, people in this workplace make this, and that is then used over here by these people, right? And that is embedded in circular. It's mediated by macro structures that are mediated by money, by media, by all of these things. Does that make sense?
I don't know. I think honestly what this boils down to
Congratulations,
is that
Superstructure
you guys hear
now.
me say log off, and you take it personally. I think that's because
So what's wrong with the personal?
Here's honestly the issue is that I don't say stop doing what you're doing. I'm not saying people shouldn't, if they feel like they have something to contribute to the question of money supply or whatever the hell you guys talk about, that they shouldn't contribute it. Like, you guys have abilities and skill sets related to those questions. You have a desire to express them, do so. Everyone needs to do that. I mean, I'm still doing my show.
Part of what we are sort of thinking is that, in terms of taking it personal, not really. I don't give a shit. But it's like the idea of things like MMT or the Green New Deal is like cultivating a care economy, right? Like we want to be funding jobs where we care for the environment, we care for each other, yada, yada. And it's like, the thing is, we do care for each other. It's like, it's not because you're online that you have to say it's good or you did something. The point is, sometimes you just want to be connecting to people, and there's all different tactics and ways, but it doesn't, and those things have their flaws within the structures, but we're always building structures, we're always building institutions, we're always interacting with people because that's just what we do. Like, I feel like that zero sum of like, oh, is it worth it or not? Are you doing something useful or not? It's like, you're always, don't we want to affirm each other as lefties in like doing shit that is of any kind that is interrelational, because that's what we already are and how we already feel?
Yes, I think you should. I see. Here's the thing: is that I've never told anybody to stop doing anything that they're doing, whether it's consuming or producing any media product. It is simply about giving it the proper emotional valence. And I honestly, like with all this stuff, I'm mostly talking about myself to try to like therapeutize myself away from my worst instincts. And the degree to which people listen to me when I talk about this stuff tells me that I'm not just talking about myself. I'm expressing some sort of phenomenon that is at least generalizable beyond me specifically, if not maybe me beyond like a demographic slice of people who would, you know, be likely to listen to me in the first place. But my main point to people is that this isn't politics.
What is politics?
Whatever else it is, it's something I don't know yet. It's coming into being. What we call politics now, to me, cannot do what we want it to do in any sense. Now, that doesn't mean that what we're doing will not, and it has to. As you said, everything's interrelated. It's not like you can sever it. It will contribute to what comes next, what challenges the current hegemony, but that we can't invest our faith in it as a deliverer. That's it.
I want to like just note like two terms, I think, because I think one thing to flag is what you're articulating about media is essentially a sort of Hegelian bad infinity, and you know we can bracket that.
Max,
I
that's
think
too collegiate. Just calm down.
I think we would have a critique of Hegel on that front, but again, that's not what this conversation is about. One can look to our catalog for that. But one thing I want to say though is that like care is political, right? And you're talking about, and I certainly noticed listening to your stream that you are talking like thinking with and thinking about a therapeutic sort of media approach for yourself that then is related, right? And offers relatedness, which is not to say that care in that sense is only what is at stake in the political, but that the way in which that intersects with the way we advocate and resist forces of precarity that's intrinsically linked. And we want to link that not just at the level of our interpersonal relation, but at the level of our analysis as well. And to articulate a care economy through a perspective that honors that particularity and its relatedness, but also can't be reduced to a sort of immediate sensuous care relation, right? And so I guess that's sort of what we're attempting to articulate. And I don't think I think on neoliberalism, certainly we agree with you in many, many ways. And I'm resonating with that sense of having to reckon with, again, that's why I contextualize this podcast. We started this podcast after Bernie's loss as well, in part, a sort of self-care relationship of expression and figuring out ideas and navigating the world, right? But also because we thought we had an analytical apparatus that went along with it. And so I think that's essentially what we're saying, right? You're not in a workplace in the traditional sense.
No.
But you are likewise feeling these material feelings, right? If you want to call them that are relational, that have structures, that are malleable too. And so we want to link that up to a political practice that doesn't reduce itself to this sort of circular sort of bad infinity of consciousness in an analytical sense. And I'm not saying you have to agree, but I just want to say that that's sort of what we're trying to get after here and why I think we thought talking with you would be productive.
Well, I hope it has been. I don't know. I mean, for you guys, I don't. I mean, I always find it productive because that's my job, and I like engaging with people on all these issues to try to make them make more sense to myself. I don't know.
I think we just.
I don't know if it was for anyone
who
listens to it or for you guys. I have no idea if it was productive. I have no idea.
Well, and I guess we want to hold open that space in the sense of we never know when the opportunity is going to present itself, right? And Bernie was certainly an opportunity. I mean, we have no qualms about that. We were, even us MMTers were all on board with Bernie, even though he didn't say the things we wanted him to, right? Because Bernie didn't speak to everything that everyone on the left wanted to. But it's okay to obviously bracket certain things in certain ways. I guess that's precisely what we're suggesting when it comes to this sort of nodal matrix of resistance. It's not. It actually, I think, is ultimately a sort of from a place of both analytical clarity that we think we have to offer, but also a humility with regards to the historical context in which resistance and victories come into being. Because I think, personally, you mentioned DSA earlier, I think AOC was a victory. Now, was AOC a total victory? No, of course not, right? Same with Ilhan Omar and same with Rashida Tlaib, who's now, talking about $1 trillion coins and has bills to just give everyone a bunch of money, right? There are all different contexts in which
nor
these
are we
things get
huge,
popularized.
and we have our critiques of DSA as well, right? I mean,
gonna let that silence hang. No, I mean, I think one thing, and maybe this does speak to DSA, even though I didn't really have anything prepared to say about DSA in particular, but we want to recast when we think about we're offering ideas as participation in this political process, but it's not a flat participation that is just this kind of mass kind of democracy that's everybody's voice has equal weight, and then there's not that you're a Maoist, but that there would be some kind of a mass line or some kind of a party apparatus or something that synthesizes that voice. I think we want to attend to all the particularities of the forms of media that we create as participation, because I think that in flattening all language and all discourse into just discourse, right? Just noise, right? That's the neoliberal marketplace of ideas, right? That's the, and yes, neoliberals are at the helms of a lot of fucking powerful institutions, and they do have this, marketplace of noise, right? Where we're all consumers of each other's noise, and that's gonna pick, who has a bigger platform or something like that. But ultimately, we don't want to, right? The neoliberal gaze, if you could call it that, or perspective, yes, it's inflecting the production of all of these institutions and the design and all of these things, but it doesn't exhaust reality. And we don't want to just take that as at its word and say, yes, we are fallen into the marketplace of ideas, or the marketplace of the party, right? Where everything that we say is just an input into the particle mass or something like that. I think we,
are you denying gravity, Will? Are you denying?
Every day.
Yeah. Like I said, I do not expect anyone to stop doing anything they're doing media-wise, because they're doing it for a reason. They're doing it because they feel like they need to in some respect, and that's nothing that that any argument is going to engage and is going to interfere with. It's a deeper
question too. It's about, that's also an analogy for politics writ large, right? About the whether we're just all shouting to the void right now, we care, right? And so I don't think we are shouting to the void, but regardless, still that's an analogy for a larger question, which is political practice. That's why the question matters, right? Because you also have
I just don't think that political practice is going to emerge from this this mechanism. It might inflect behaviors,
But
only
regardless,
if the people who are engaging with it have properly contextualized what they're getting out of that. Because I've watched over the last 4 years the socialist explosion turn into a sterile realm of repeated and endless argumentation because it's not grounded in anything.
So why then do we end up at the guillotine or the helicopters? That, you talked about how like everything then, it sounds like we're atomized, like connection is like irrevocably severed, and then basically what that leaves is interpersonal meso-macro violence, right? And that we end up at the helicopters or guillotines because revenge is all that's left. And so what does that say about our current moment, or what? I mean, I guess there is still something, all of ideas
at stake.
We're
fighting. We have to fight the forces of reaction as they pop up, right? I mean, the Hollies of the world who are trying to cultivate.
See, this is a thing. I don't agree with that. Josh Hawley. Who knows who this asshole is? Who knows who Josh Hawley is?
I don't mean to reduce it just to Josh Hawley.
I just mean it's like the people who looked at the Trump phenomenon and said, "Oh, someone's going to turn this into an ideologically coherent machinery, and that's going to be the death of us all." As if ideological coherence is key to Trump's appeal to his control, to his power over the Republican base, or the reason that all those working class people and all those minorities voted for him this time. It's not.
You yourself
it is a caudillism. It is a spectacle that they are part of.
That's not emotional or related to power.
It's emotional, exactly. You're talking. Josh Hawley's not emotional. Josh Hawley's trying to square the circle and turn a bunch of policy papers together, and that's not where the energy comes from.
I actually think that Trump was playing on a coherent framework. It just was a coherent framework that he found. Right? It was the zero-sum Thatcher framework that says that, when people come into the country, it means that there are less jobs available for the people who are already here, right? Like the ideological work laying down that foundation, that already existed. And so Trump just needed to, come in and like shout. But I think, Josh Hawley, fine, is not like a household name necessarily, but Tucker Carlson certainly is, right? And there is a rise of fascism around the world. And
I don't agree with that either. No, I don't agree that there's any kind of fascist conditions. People are at the leading edge of people are all mean and shitty and they want to hurt each other, as they've said, and they're willing to vote to make that happen. But fascism presupposes this idea of a politicized citizenry. Who have turned their lives into politics.
I was at National
and
Stadium.
That's not what we have. We have 300 million individuals who do not who have no investment in a project beyond that. We were supposed to see pogroms. Remember, after Trump lost or won, Trump losing was supposed and Trump losing and then refusing to ratify the results of his loss was supposed to unleash a wave of political violence in this country. I could show you a million people saying that was going to happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because at the end of the day, this is a sports fandom for most of these fascists that people are worried about.
So you don't think the U.S. police killing
That's not
people
fascism. That's the mechanism of pure, raw, authoritarian exploitation that is going to replace
so if you call
political
it
consensus.
Fascism or... I've been in 2017. I was helping like an old commie whose dad was tortured in National Stadium, and I had people in MAGA hats chant "Build the Wall" at me, who were wearing, a guy who has this guy's a psycho, but he has a YouTube channel where they put subtitles on Jordan Peterson videos, and they were wearing shirts that say "Poor fascist pride." And this is at National
they also
Stadium.
probably have a shirt that says "Go Raiders." It's just part of their culture. It's part of their identity performance.
But that's like, I mean, the aestheticization of politics is quintessential to and structurally a component of neo-fascisms and fascism historically.
No, this is politics turning into aesthetics, where you just observe. That's what we're getting into. The authoritarianism will be there. The cages will be there. The concentration camps will be there. But they're not going to be there because of some act of marshaled citizen energy, it's going to be because we're just pressing buttons on we're picking one group or another to be the subject in our minds of the punishments of a inexorable slide towards zero-sum neoliberal immiseration.
So
Okay, well, that's what we have to fight.
that the mechanism of that will not be decided by people acting consciously as political agents. It'll be the same mechanism that has been turning behind the scenes of politics for the past 40 years.
So I don't want to just like I don't want to naturalize or denaturalize, I guess, like, or take fascism out of the context of liberalism, because I think that we would argue on this podcast, and we don't have time to fully unpack this, so I know that you're going to disagree, but we would argue that fascism is liberalism's subconscious, which is to say that it is conditioned by the reification of ultimately of money and of political provisioning as necessarily zero sum. And if you look,
fascism, see, this is, I guess I'm historically
well, hold on. Let me
right,
just finish this really quick. Like if you look at like propaganda posters, like in the Third Reich, right? Like you would see posters that have somebody with disabilities, right? That were like eugenicist posters that would say, this person cost the German taxpayer this much money, right? So like if you reify money as being fundamentally private, then eventually, yeah, people are going to start wanting to organize around what they think is their concrete shared material circumstance. Whereas what I'm saying, and what we're saying, is that all of the differences in all of these concrete material circumstances, like our embodied shared interests with our, coworkers in this particular firm, relates analogically to every other part of the economy, and doesn't require flattening into, one concrete common denominator shared interest. And in fact, doing so, we would argue, is what leads to, and setting aside historically whether this is, setting aside historically, like when fascism starts or, like whatever, like these are the logics of fascism. And I think that that's what we want to, what we want to, kind of suggest is that the logics of fascism are more self-aware and reflexive liberal logics. And they're more self-reflexive about the fact that politics has been rendered as a distributional conflict between people who are fundamentally different and have individuated interests. And, you naturalize the citizenry as, you take, white people or natives or, blood and soil, right? It's kind of immanence. And you naturalize it, and you say that it's, a political body, and then everything that's on the outside, right? Like you have the center of the Venn diagram, and then you put the outsides of the Venn diagram in concentration camps. But the point is that the Venn diagram is like, we shouldn't be reifying it and participating in its construction.
I would agree that I think fascism, honestly, is a historical phenomenon. I do think that well, like fascism in interwar Europe was, yes, the subconscious of liberalism. I agree. The subconscious of liberalism was always just mere compulsion, because it's because liberalism is sort of the superstructural armor of capitalism, and what facilitates that is some condition of post scarcity, and that when scarcity comes back in, that's what eats away at the liberalism and reveals sort of the machinery beneath. Now, in interwar Europe, fascism was the emergent because of these specific conditions of those socially bound citizenries. I would say now we have a similar situation where our liberal superstructural justifications for capitalism are degrading before our eyes and revealing something beneath. But the something beneath is not a mass movement. It's not people in the streets. It is just the technological machinery of neoliberalism, both in, I mean, in all, when I say technology, I'm talking about everything from like the apps that allow for the creation of this new sort of returning of like a servant economy with Uber and things like that, and also drone surveillance, police military technology. All of these things are filling the space that in a previous generation and in a different place would be filled by political party and political activism and people in the streets, stormtroopers. That role is superfluous because we are post-political people. Now, that doesn't mean we're doomed. It means that we have to recreate a political. And ideas like the ones you're talking about are going to inevitably be part of that. But what's going to bring it about is going to be people, to some degree or another, just dropping what they've learned, what they think they have learned, and finding out how they actually relate to their fellow workers and citizens and friends and family, and then moving from that point towards a coordinated action and a rediscovery of political power.
So I think, with that, I think we probably played out the conversation in the sense of the distinctions and our arguments. And so I guess unless you had any pressing thoughts, we'd probably say to leave it there and let the conversation speak to itself. But I do appreciate, Matt, you coming on Superstructure. It's certainly I enjoyed the conversation. I think the listeners will too.
Yeah, me too. I had a fun time.